Let us move on to our next questioner at the microphone over there. Mr. Edelman.
Welcome to America, Mr. Mandela. I'm Ken Edelman. Those of us who share your struggle for human rights and against apartheid have been somewhat disappointed by the models of human rights that you have held up since being released in jail. You've met over the last 6 months 3 times with Yasser Arafat, who you have praised. You have told Gaddafi that you share the view on, and applaud him on his record of human rights and his drive for freedom and peace around the world. And you have praised Fidel Castro as a leader of human rights and said that Cuba was one of the countries that's head and shoulders above all other countries in human rights, despite the fact that documents at the United Nations and elsewhere show that Cuba is one of the worst. I was just wondering, are these your models of leaders of human rights? And if so, would you want a Gaddafi or an Arafat or a Castro to be a future president of South Africa?
One of the mistakes which some political analysts make is to think that their enemies should be our enemies.
Welcome once again to Red Star Over Asia. This is part 2 of a 2-part conversation and discussion with Rodrigo Huamachi, comrade of ours in Havana, Cuba. We had a wide-ranging conversation about everything from the legacy of the Cuban Revolution to how the Chinese and Vietnamese models are influencing the trajectory of the Cuban Revolution now, the contradictions of those models and how Cuban comrades are critiquing that and trying to sustain the spirit of their socialist project in the face of very difficult international circumstances. This latter part of the conversation, which is episode 2, we also get into the recent quote-unquote protests that happened in Cuba and that were in the news recently. But anyway, before you proceed with this episode, we highly recommend that you hit the pause button and that you go and listen to part 1 first, because I think you'll get a lot more out of this part 2 episode if you do that. But in any case, thank you for listening. We appreciate you, comrades. Enjoy the episode.
Now, the Communist Party. The Communist Party has a Congress every 5 years, average. And the Communist Party, in every Congress and every period, they come out with recommendations, with suggestions, with things that as a result of the discussion, the result of the of debate and analysis of his members, they say, look, we should go that way. The Communist Party cannot pass any law, cannot implement any law. It's totally independent to the government. In a sense, when I say in a sense, it's because they make influence in the government because, as I said, it's a vanguard party that made recommendations, and those recommendations the government listen. So, for example, this new constitution actually came out of the Communist Party. The Communist Party for years have a live discussion debate. By the way, those debates are not only for members; those debates are for everyone. Are led by the Communist Party, but anybody can participate in. So those guidelines are basically general, broad recommendation, kind of pointing out where we should go, okay? And then the government came and started to debate again with experts, with academics who participated on various research and come out with political proposals. And those political proposals are either passed in the National Assembly or in the case of the Constitution, end up in a referendum, in a popular referendum.
Can you explain, the context behind these constitutional reforms? I remember happening around the same time that the Obama administration was lifting the embargo, and just what were the reforms happening and how was the process?
Fidel Castro in the early 21st century, he was already calling to retake this rectification process that began in 1980s. And this is, sorry to make a little history, but the rectification process in 1980s was never finished. Why was never finished? Because when it was happening, it was happening the collapse of the Soviets and the Eastern European, and then we got in this economic crisis. This economic crisis made a change of the priorities. So this rectification process was never finished. Actually, was kind of put it on hold because in the 1990s was the major goal was to get out of the crisis, to resist and get out of the crisis. So in the year 2000, Fidel Castro again decided, look, we need to continue making our changes, and we need to continue to do critical analysis to our society on how we're going. And part of that, it was actually what we call them the new generation taking over, the continuity. And, the Fidel generation was getting old, people were dying, and a new generation was taking over. So to assure the continuity of the revolution and to assure the goals of the revolution, it was needed to demand changes. So when Raúl Castro took over, Raúl Castro put it as a priority in his government to continue these changes. And these changes look easier to implement, but they had to be a result of a debate, and they had to be a result of consensus. And this is important in Cuban democracy. Cuban democracies, it had to do with consensus. When people go to vote in the parliament, or when people make decisions, before that, there's a large number of debates, discussion, consultation, in order to come out with a consensus proposal. And that's something probably one of the key secrets of Cuban system success is that they have been able to come out with proposals that are good for everyone or for the majority. So it was needed to change the constitution. In the 1990s, there was two reforms of the constitution. In the 1992, there was a reform of the constitution, and then in the year 2002, there was a reform of the constitution. Small but important. But what was called by Raúl Castro was actually to change revise the whole constitution. And there was a lot of pending things. For example, one of the issues that was very hot during that is that we didn't have same-sex marriage because the constitution in 1967 didn't allow same-sex marriage. So we had to change that in order to pass a law to allow same-sex marriage. So the Communist Party called for a debate and come out with a proposal. That proposal was debated. In my case, I was able to debate it I had the opportunity to debate it in three different groups of people. I debated in my neighborhood, I debated with my co-workers, I debated with other revolutionaries, with other communists. So in three different things in which we were able to give opinions, to suggest amendments, to suggest changes, and so on. So this debate that happened first run by the Communist Party, okay? Because the Communist Party was trying to come out with a proposal to the government, a draft, let's say, in which the vast majority of Cubans participated. Yes, for example, in my experience, in each different debate, the priority of those groups were different. For example, in my neighborhood, people were more interested about salaries, about wages, about housing, about more practical things. With my co-workers, were more like kind of things more political, more like kind of how we elect a president and things. With my revolutionary groups, people were more about philosophical. So, in each debate, people have their own priority. But in my case, I had the opportunity to have those three debates and I have extensive debates and be able to listen to people and actually to have the opportunity to people to read the proposal. And in many countries, people don't even read what the government proposed. Here, people, at least they read. At least they listen what other people had to say. So this debate, in each debate, there was someone taking note for the suggestions, changes, modification, etc. And those notes were sent to a commission. This commission, this national commission, revised the first draft. And surprisingly, more than 60% of the original proposal was either changed, modified, or amended based on people's input. And that made a tremendous political action that a country can face. I mean, I never seen or never studied any other country who had a massive consultation.
Well, no, when you told me about this for the first time, Rodrigo, I was shocked. I mean, I'm from the US, which has appointed itself like the guardian of democratic values, quote unquote, around the world. And when you first described to me the constitutional process years ago, I mean, that's something I've never seen. There's nothing even remotely like that in the US or any EU country or these countries that sort of condescendingly lecture Cuba about human rights and democracy. I mean, it's far more deeply democratic than anything that most people have seen.
Yes, Mike. I mean, it is amazing. Now, it was not the first time that Cuba does it, but in terms of the constitution, yes, it was the first time. In the 1990s, during the special period, what was called the Workers' Parliament, in which the government made a proposal with the changes, the economic changes that we're going to do, and people debated and make an input when the increase of tourism, allowing foreign investment, taxation, generating private employment, etc. Cuba had experience, but in terms of changing the Carta Magna, or the main documents of a country, which is the Constitution, it was very unique. I mean, very unique. And that process took months. It was something gradually. It wasn't something like, okay, you have a couple months. No. It was took a couple, 2 years, the whole process. It wasn't like about overnight. So these original documents, the draft that the government sent to the people, was modified 60%, huge. 60%, and then the government came out with a new draft, and the government released all the statistics also. Let me say, thousands of people give an opinion on terms of this. Thousands of people. At that time, it wasn't a debate that we all agree, because one of the hot issues of this constitution was the same sex marriage. In the first proposal, it was actually make it constitutional, the same sex marriage. But during the crisis and during the last 20 years in Cuba, we've seen an increase of fundamentalist and evangelist churches in Cuba. There's a separation of the state and church in Cuba, so you are free to practice any religion you want. And we have an increase of evangelic churches in Cuba that made an impact on Cuban population, because they mostly came during the economic crisis in the 1990s. And those churches mostly were funded by the United States, by the U.S. churches, or let's say not the U.S. churches, but outside churches, powerful churches, from Jehovah's Witness to all this number of evangelics. And on those evangelics, they came with conservative approaches, very conservative approaches. So that make an impact on people. So when you say same-sex marriage, the churches will say, you're going to legalize homosexuality, you're going to teach your children, and your children are not going to know if they're going to be lesbian and gay, the whole propaganda, to trash this thing. So it wasn't easy either. I mean, you have campaigns, organized campaigns on certain issues on the Constitution. And that's why the Constitution ended up finally with a consensus in which allows same marriage, but it's not explicit. It said, and now we're in the current debate on the family code, in which we're going to legislate, hopefully, same-sex marriage. And it's interesting, because in a socialist society, those things should be, we should be in the vanguard. We should be, ahead on the rest of the world. But we have forces and powerful forces who are against that and trying to diminish that. And in fact, it's a campaign by churches and some average people who are not even belong to a church, but they listen to arguments and they, I don't want my children to have homosexuality classes in 3rd grade, because I'll having open homosexual teachers teaching to my children, that type of things. That type of things that people get a little scared. And in fact, Cuba has culturally is very has been a machista society, even though we, in the last 60 years, have been at a tremendous effort to smash machismo, sexism, and something like that. But still, certain ideas culturally running. And when you have somebody say, look at the government is going to teach your children this and that, and they're going to pervert, people get scared. You get scared because your children are going to be facing that. So that's just one example. So those debates came out with a document that then was presented, that document, to the National Assembly. And then the National Assembly debated again for months. So the document that was taken with all the input of the people, the National Assembly debated and discussed it, and also they made recommendation as a parliament. They said, look, and mostly were technical recommendations, mostly were legal recommendations and term. Not much in the essential. And until we finally in 2018, late 2018, we got a final draft, and that draft was made available. The country printed that draft and gave it practically for free to everyone who wanted to keep it. It was digital, was written, so everybody had the draft, and they organized the referendum. The referendum was actually on February 2019, in which it was a great exercise of democracy, a great exercise of popular participation. There was a great turnout, and the results are very simple. 86% of the voters voted in favor of this new constitution. Around 9% voted against it, and then the rest were nulls or spoiled ballots. So with a big majority, Cuba was able to ratify, to approve a new constitution, which is the one that is running today. And that was a major political victory for Cuba, because it was able to show not only to Cubans, but also to the world that we can have, with sovereignty, with independence, we can run and make our own changes. The concept of revolution that became very famous, and is still very famous now, that made Fidel Castro in the year 2000, in a very short speech that he gave to 1 million people in a May Day parade in the year 2000, he said that revolutionaries need to change, everything needs to be changed. He said everything that had to change needs to be changed. So with that concept, we said, yes, we need to continue changing. And revolution means change. We need to continue transforming this society. And by having this very progressive vanguard constitution, if you read our Cuban constitution, we are really ahead of many constitutions, especially with the very old constitution that the United States has. The United States has a very old constitution, more than 200 years. And in fact, most people will say, it is time that you need to update it. We can't have a thing change in the world. So with this new constitution that has been running since just 2 years, we are now implementing it. We're in the process of implementing it, because this constitution gives the legal framework to pass new laws that had to go along with the constitution. One of them is the family code, which is the most controversial, because we're in the moment of debating, and the family code, and actually it's called now in plural, the family's code, because the concept of family now is changing. We're saying the family is not just a man and a woman and children. It could be 2 men, could be 2 women, could be 3 people. The Constitution allows us to think in the most broader term of what a family is. That discussion is happening right now, and it is going to be another referendum, not only for the same-sex marriage, but also for the whole family code, because the family code basically is the legal judicial framework to implement all those things. One of the things that is important in the Constitution is to understand that the Constitution gives you the right to every Cuban to defend the Constitution, defend the Constitution, even by arms. That means that anything that goes to the Constitution, all Cubans will have the right to go and defend it. And this is important, because what's happening today, some people are questioning the Constitution, and by questioning the Constitution, we have the right to defend it. We have the right to say, look, here, everything that's unconstitutional is not going to have any space in our Cuba today. And one of the things that the Constitution said is the one-party system. One-party system actually doesn't say one-party system, but they said that the Communist Party is not electoral, the Communist Party is separate from the government, that our elections are not based on political parties and campaign. And there are some people who are requesting a multi-party system in Cuba. And a multi-party system in Cuba, we know what it's like, a multi-party system. And I think Cuba had the right, the sovereignty and independence to develop his own political system. And we don't have to have a political system the same than Guatemala or the Haiti or the United States or South Korea. Every country has the right to develop their own system. Now, there's another issue in the Constitution. It's about rights, that that goes along on the Human Rights Declaration. And all the Human Rights Declaration, it is part of the Constitution of Cuba. Every single right, not only the right of freedom of speech or the freedom of assembly, but also the right to health, the right to work, the right of safety. So it's very explicit in the Constitution. So that means for revolutionaries in Cuba, the Constitution is the most important document, and we need to know the Constitution very well, because this document give us all the principles, give us all the values, give us all the elements to defend our process and to build a process. So whenever we're going to sit in a discussion, we say, look, as long as we are inside of our Constitution, we can discuss everything. But if you are outside of the Constitution, you are not respecting the majority of us who voted in favor. When we say 86% of the voted, 86%, large number, 86% of the people who voted in favor of the Constitution need to be respected. That's what democracy is. Because there's a campaign in the United States to question the Constitution and to not recognize this Constitution, not recognize it. And this is something that we're not going to accept. We're not going to accept, period. I mean, we can negotiate, we can talk, we can criticize, but it had to do within the framework of these documents.
So, yeah, that was a lot to take in. You briefly mentioned going to Vietnam and seeing for yourself what the model being implemented, how the lives were being changed. Could you talk more about that? How the Vietnamese and Chinese models influenced the debates within the Cuban Communist Party about how to move forward regarding marketization and liberalization?
Before I go that, let me kind of recreate a little bit about the tendencies that we have in Cuba now as my personal view, okay? As my personal view. By the way, I'm not giving any official opinion here. I'm just all giving my personal perspective as Rodrigo, okay? And this is important because I'm not speaking on behalf of the government, I'm not speaking on behalf of any institution. I'm speaking on my own personal approach. And of course, my opinion can be different of other comrades' opinion. So my take on what's happening in Cuba today in terms of tendency, especially among economists, especially among policymakers who are more influential in this process because, for the specialty. Among economists, there's a group of economists who are really looking into the Chinese model and the Vietnamese model. And they're studying it. They're taking it very seriously. And they know it very well. Most of those economists have gone to Vietnam and they have relations, they've written papers, etc., etc. So they have knowledge of the success or the failure of those models. That is one of the tendencies to look at those models. And there's another one, which is the one I defend myself, in which that we say, yes, we need to learn from those processes, but we have to create our own process here. And we have our own characteristics, we have our own conditions, and we made the mistake at some point to imitate the Soviet model. We proved it, and it was proved that we were wrong, and we could not import it, a model. We can learn from it. And there's other, of course, the other people they want to look more about Latin America and that the Venezuelan process, even though with all the challenges that the Venezuelan process has, people are looking into that. Say, look, we need to learn about what is working or not working in those processes. Now, with Vietnam, we have political and historical relationship, and very beautiful relationship. Fidel went to Vietnam. A lot of Cubans went to Vietnam. Cubans supported Vietnam during the war. We have a lot of student exchanges. Vietnamese students have come here to study here. Cuban students are going to Vietnam, etc. So in spite of the distance, and in spite of the cultural difference, and in spite of the realities, there is a sense of sisterhood with Vietnam. And there's a sense of being pride, of being friends, of being helping with each other. Recently Vietnam decided to donate, I believe, 2,000 million tons of rice I'm not sure about the exact figure, but a ship of rice during this moment, and that's an act of solidarity. When a country make a donation like that, we're not talking about developed, economic developed country, but a country who's still, struggling with a lot of things, decided to donate to another. It's a show that there's some sort of a sisterhood. So that relationship, that political relationship, is a priority, regardless of what you might agree or disagree with the Vietnamese model. Okay, I think there's some policies that have been implemented in Cuba today, especially these recent couple of years, are very similar to what Vietnam did a few years ago, in terms of giving a little more power to the private sector, giving more flexibility to producers, farmer producers, giving more flexibility to for investment, foreign investment to the private sector. So I believe that the government, yes, it is taking. There's some influence. There's influence of the Vietnamese model, but the general tendency, still be more like, yes, we learn from there, but we have to adapt it, adjust it, and create our own model. And in terms of the Chinese model, I mean, it is funny because China have investment in all over Latin America, but the investment is not as big in Cuba as in other countries. A lot of people will suppose that China should invest more in Cuba than Chile or Brazil or any country that has a clear capitalist approach, or even they have right-wing governments. Because it seems that Chinese investment doesn't look much about who is in government. It looks more about the business opportunities and the mutual benefit. So a lot of people say, well, Chinese should invest more in Cuba. We should increase our relationship with China. But in fact, it's more the Vietnamese influence, and also the Vietnamese model is more kind of fixed, perhaps better than the Cuban model than the Chinese model. Because if we look at the Chinese model in terms of the economic, a lot of people feel that they went too far. They went too far in terms of privatization, in terms of the free market policies. And when you think it's going too far, you get a little cautious. So people who defend the Chinese model say, well, they had to do it in order to become power in the world, but they maintain the political system very strictly.
I'm glad to hear you say that because, I think all of us on this podcast, to one degree or another, we have different attitudes about China. I mean, that's a complicated issue. But yeah, you're right that there is a general critique out there that there's various forms of it that China went way too far in marketization, liberalization. And I will be honest with you, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I will be honest with you, when I went to Cuba, on the one hand, I spent a month there in Havana. I went to Santa Clara, Camagüey, Santiago de Cuba, traveled the whole breadth of the island. I will say in Havana in particular, I mean, you can start to see the seeds of sort of the material foundations for a capitalist kind of like you can see the material foundations for a future counter-revolutionary movement that could be easily manipulated by the U.S. Whereas when I went to Santiago in the eastern part of the island, which is where most of the revolutionary fighting took place during the revolution, predominantly Afro-Cuban city, there's a very distinct difference, at least for me as an outsider. Maybe I'm wrong, but this is my perspective as a foreigner who spent time in Cuba. In Santiago, there's a sense just in the air that people there are much more enthusiastically embedded in the revolutionary process. It's very much a part of their souls and who they are. I mean, for example, as soon as I got off the bus in Santiago, as I was doing my travels from Havana all the way to the other end of the island, which for people who don't know Cuban geography, Santiago is on the opposite side of the island, not too far away from Guantanamo Bay, actually. But yeah, I mean, some of the people I first met and hung out with, it's like a guy walking down the street with a Maduro campaign hat on, From my experience, there's clearly still enthusiasm for the revolution in Cuba, but in Havana, especially in old Havana, tourist sectors, some of the more developed neighborhoods, you are starting to see how this influx of money and sort of loosening up regulations around opening restaurants and like private businesses is, I mean, that eventually, that material foundation will eventually maybe have a really dangerous political manifestation in the future. And curious what you think about that, and if debates within the party, or if people are talking about how to manage, on the one hand, the need to make concessions to the geopolitical reality that Cuba is in a difficult situation and is going to have to make concessions to capitalism. But on the other hand, trying to manage those things and be aware of the fact that in the future they could be the catalyst for counter-revolutionary, shit that, like what happened in the Soviet Union in the late 80s.
Sure, it definitely makes sense what you're saying. Something that we didn't talk about Obama time, and that's when Cuba again started to regain some sort of prosperity because the new relationship with the U.S. and at a major risk when we make flexibilization on the private sector and give more possibility to the private sector to emerge and to develop. We are talking here in Cuba also the involvement of Florida of the United States because the closeness. And that's something, that's a risk. I mean, on one hand, you have people from the United States investing informally in Cuba because the blockade doesn't allow you to invest directly, but basically people bring in money in cash to their relatives or friends and say, look, let's make a business. Let's put a restaurant together. Let's have a little hotel together. There's a number of areas in which you can develop your own small private business. So, yes, there is a risk because when money comes and when you have empower yourself economically, you obviously have a political influence and the rest. And it is something very complex. And I've been working lately a lot with the private sector in terms of the political participation of the private sector and how people envision that and how politically you move. And it's true what you're saying. When you have money, when you are successful, and also you develop your ties with the United States stronger, politically you change your vision and say yes. You got a little kind of in love with this new idea, and you start to see capitalism somehow works in Cuba, and that could be political dangers.
So, for example, when I went to Cuba, so a lot of people don't realize this, Cuba until recently has had a dual currency system. So when I was there was the Cuban peso, which is used by Cuban citizens, and there's the CUC, which is pegged to the US dollar, and that's what tourists are supposed to use. But one thing that I found a little worrisome when I was there is that, I was there for a month, so I made lots of Cuban friends, and like the currency difference, because tourists are not allowed to use Cuban pesos. So like when I went there, I made some friends, and then, I switched out my CUCs for local Cuban pesos. And at one point I was told by a bus driver that the public buses are for Cubans only. There is this weird thing where if you're a tourist, especially in Havana, in old Havana, which is very touristy, like there's a lot of stuff it's clearly set up for tourists, and it's a beautiful historical place. I highly recommend everybody visits it. But there is a sense that it's sort of like tourists should go on this one track and use this one currency, where it's like the tourists are supposed to like pay CUCs tied to the US dollar to pay taxi drivers with the fancy kind of like old 1950s Cuban cars that are kind of romanticized in US culture about old Havana or whatever. But obviously when I went there, I wanted to like go to Copayela, the famous state-run ice cream shop. I wanted to ride the bus. I wanted to go into the countryside. And I had those opportunities because my Cuban friends took me around. People were very welcoming or whatever, but it was very weird that there's this dual currency system where tourists are not allowed to like use the local currency, and like even, being told by a bus driver that I can't be on public transportation. And then I talked to a number of people who, because of the embargo, you have your official state job, which the wages are low, right? I mean, even doctors in Cuba don't make that much money. So a lot of people do have like side hustles. Like, for example, my friend that I told you about, I mean, he has his like official job, but then he sells like black market chorizo sausages. So I like accompanied him as he was selling them, and we just went around and visited all these different houses. And he understands, and I understand that this is you're in a difficult economic situation. Like you got to hustle to pay the bills, right? But a lot of Cubans are very angry about the fact that like if they earn money working in the tourism sector, they have to deal with this dual currency system. So recently, the government has tried to fuse the two currencies and phase out the CUC. And from what I've read, that is a factor in the economic crisis. I mean, obviously, the main factor in the economic crisis going on right now is the U.S. tightening the blockade because they see an opportunity. Cuba's on their knees. They're at a down point. The U.S. always kicks Cuba while they're down. That's obviously the major factor in all of this. But at the same time, like, can you talk a little bit about the currency situation and what the debate was and what the rationale was behind having two currencies at the same time? Because that's very unusual. I mean, most countries don't have two parallel currencies.
One thing that we have to say is that we have a before and after. On January 1st, 2020 of this year, the currency was unified. So the dual currency system is no longer happening now. And I'm going to refer a little bit to that. Yes, the CUC was a currency basically that was exchangeable to hard currency since the Cuban peso, the national currency, was not exchangeable to any hard currency. So that's mean by paying in UCUC, that was a way to attract the hard currency that tourists bring. But one thing that I want to clear, the CUC, it was no exclusive currency for foreigners. It was also a currency that Cubans used. And since all the private sector was allowed to function in both currency, and a lot of state workers were getting bonuses in CUC. Okay, because the CUC obviously give you the opportunity to access to better quality services or certain stores that were only sold product in CUC. But it was not prohibited for Cubans. In fact, Cubans had to use the CUC in the daily life. And the way that people get CUC basically were either remittances, you get dollars or euros from your family, and you go to the bank and exchange it to CUC. And that CUC was a Cuban hard currency, and every Cuban was allowed to use it. And even you could go to a hotel that was designed for tourists and pay, if you pay it in CUC, you can stay in the hotel. Yes, was not the majority, but there was a sector that was actually go to every summer to spend a week vacation, a resort that was designed for mostly foreign tourists. Two, a lot of people got CUC through the private business. If you have a restaurant, you rent a room, mostly for foreigners, tourists, you will pay with CUC and you use that CUC. Three, you were getting extra bonuses, state worker in CUC. It was a way to incentive workers because salaries were low, but they will give you a bonus in CUC so you could use your CUC in a CUC store. And four, even if you don't have CUC, you could go and exchange your Cuban pesos to CUC and use those to CUC in any part of the country. So, what you're saying, Mike, your experience was totally correct, but it was not exclusively for foreigners. Most Cuban, I would say the vast majority of the Cuban had to use CUC because there is certain product that you only can buy in CUC. And if you didn't have CUC, you go to one of those cadeca and one of those exchange houses, and you pay 24 pesos for one CUC. So that's something important. Now,
well, wait, hold on one second, Rodrigo. I guess I didn't express myself clearly. I know that Cubans can use CUCs, but my understanding there was that foreigners can only use CUCs. So that was my question. Is that so? Like me having Cuban pesos, I think was like maybe not exactly legal. Because like some places you can only use Cuban pesos, so I had to change my money out from. I had to like give my CUCs to friends, and then they had to go to a bank and change it out for me, so I could access some places that, because there's like in Cuba there's like state-run bars, and that's the kind of places I wanted to hang out at. I didn't go to Cuba to hang out with other Canadian and American and German foreign tourists. So that's one thing I found a little bit frustrating. I'm sorry to ask you difficult questions, but I do want to challenge you a little bit about that, because I know why. I totally understand the motivation behind the dual currency system, because it brings in more cash. And I, as a U.S. person who, was making good money at the time, I would have been more than happy to pay a higher price as a foreigner for accessing those places. But the problem is that some places you can't access to as a foreigner if you only have CUCs. So yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that Cubans can't use CUCs. Yeah, I mean they use them all the time. And there was a lot of frustration with people I met about having to deal with these two currencies. It's like you have an old classic Havana car and you're making like great money driving tourists around. And this also gets to another contradiction in the Cuban economy. I mean, you have taxi drivers in old Havana and the tourist sectors who have those, classic cars that are very attractive to tourists, like a lot of Canadians and Germans who, from my experience, seem to be the primary Western, the constituency of Western tourists there. They're happy to pay like serious money to have someone drive them around and like give them a tour of old Havana. And so you have taxi drivers making more money than doctors. And like that, to me, that's a serious economic distortion. So I'm wondering how are people talking about that? Because I mean, it seems to be an obvious problem. Like taxi drivers making way more money than doctors. I mean, that's gonna cause economic problems.
Okay, technically, tourists were allowed to use Cuban peso. I mean, there was no a law that prohibits foreigners to use Cuban peso. What happened is the foreigners were encouraged to use the CUC, and the whole system make it easier for foreigners to pay in CUC because the country need the hard currency. There was few areas that foreigners were not allowed. It were mostly in the subsidized area of the economy. For example, you went to the Copelia. Copelia had one line for Cuban peso and one in CUC in the past. So foreigners supposed to go to the CUC and Cubans go to the Cuban line. However, if you go with a Cuban, nobody could stop you, at least legally, to buy in Cuban peso. What happened is the line for Cuban peso generally was longer than the line to get CUC ice cream. So it was easier for foreigners to buy the CUC. Now, in the CUC, of course, it was more expensive. In the Cuban peso, the price was subsidized. So that's why the country trying to discourage foreigners to use the pesos because, it was using the subsidized prices. When I went to Vietnam, it was a kind of similar thing. I remember I had to take the train. I had to pay a higher price for being a foreigner in Vietnam than actually a local. And, so it was kind of similar thing. Now, what you say, Mike, is totally true. I mean, the economic crisis of 1990s makes such a big impact that it was a reverse. A lot of professionals were not making as much money as somebody who rent a taxi or rent a room or have a restaurant. Yes, that disparity happened, and that's something that they tried to correct it with the new law in January. In fact, now we use only Cuban pesos, okay? And with the whole package came an increase of salary, and an increase of salary of state workers. So state workers got their salaries multiplied because by unifying the currency, make that the high currency had a different value. And especially in the underground market, the underground market which is kind of the real market value of a currency. So with this new change, the government is trying to encourage people now to value the state jobs, which is still the majority of workers work for the state, for the public sector. And so by giving a more attractive salary that can be competitive to this emerging private sector work. It's still a lot of complexity in this. I mean, it's still, except now for the pandemic, it's difficult to read it because there's no tourism. So most people who are making good money with tourism are not doing as good as they used to be. I mean, all these old American car taxi driver are not doing well now. I mean, because there's no tourists. So they had to reduce the prices to have it for Cubans. And of course, Cubans were not willing to pay the price that a tourist will pay for a taxi driver in a nice car like that. However, now they had to down the prices in order to get business because practically we don't have tourism in the last 16 months. At this point, it's difficult to read it. I mean, when you experience is an experience that is no longer now in Cuba, but it's an experience that lasted for many years. And that gave the impression, as you said, that the tourists, of course, will get more benefit than local. In fact, it was a reality. I mean, as a tourist, by bringing $2,000 from abroad, you could spend 1 week or 2 weeks eating in a nice restaurant, going to nice bars and stay in nice places, in which Cubans were more limited. There were some Cubans who would do that, but there was no majority. So that brought a conflict. Obviously, it's a conflict that Cuba, even today, has not been able to solve. And this had to do mainly with the U.S. blockade. And this is important to mention that because a lot of people see the blockade as an external force that is making damage to Cuba, but it's hard to read the daily damage. And the daily damage of the blockade in Cuba is on the economy. The main purpose of the U.S. blockade on Cuba is to strangle the economy. It's to strangle people. They say, because the blockade is attacking every sector of the economy, so Cuba can feel it and Cuba can uprise against the government. That's the political purpose of the blockade. The political purpose of the blockade is that, is to change the regime, is to overthrow the regime, is to create the conditions, so bad conditions for people that people will arise. So we cannot forget the U.S. blockade. Now, during the Obama time, which is mainly second term from 2010 to 2016, I would say for a period of 4 or 5 years, money inflow, it was significant. And the inequalities among people increases. Those people who have relatives in Miami, or those people who have businesses, private business, or even those people who work in the tourist industry, they have more access to the hard currency, and as a result, they have a better economic possibilities. And of course, it was a concern of the government. And that's why we came with this package, which, to my opinion, came too late and came in the middle of the pandemic. In the middle of pandemic, in the middle of the pandemic, at the beginning of the peak of the pandemic, which was in January, came this package in which, alleviate somehow people by create shortages because more money was in the streets. There was an increase of salary, so more people have more money to buy, but the supply, it was not as high as demand. So that's one of the main reasons why we have shortages. That's why when you go to a store, you have to make a line because there's more people with money now than actually things to buy. And that's a very complex situation. Besides the pandemic that make everything complicated, and that the workforces are being unstable because all the measures have been taken, the quarantine, etc., etc. And I think the CUC, it had to do with inequalities, and there's no question about it. And was something that I would say a desperate measure of the Cuban economy, because you want tourists to bring hard currency. You didn't want to have tourists here to benefit from the subsidized services. Public transportation at that time cost practically nothing, cost less than 1 Cuban peso, which is a couple pennies.
I just want to make it clear that I was more than happy to pay an extra tourist price to participate in things. My issue was that there were certain things that were unavailable to tourists. So there would be these subsidized, restaurants or whatever, where I would, even if you're willing to pay the extra price, which that's not my concern at all. There was a sense that the tourists are trying to keep you away a little bit from ordinary Cubans and where ordinary Cubans can hang out. And that was only true in Havana. Santiago, that was not the case. Santa Clara, Camagüey, I didn't have that experience at all. But in the tourist districts of Havana, that's my only issue. But you gave a great response. I mean, obviously the Cuban government was trying to it's not easy to develop the perfect policy for how to get in more hard currency. But I just wanted to make it clear that my issue was not that, oh, I should be able to pay what Cubans pay. Like that, it was the barriers to accessing places where I wanted to hang out, I guess.
Sure, Mike. I totally understand. I mean, when I mentioned that, I mentioned in general terms. I mean, I have friends coming from abroad, coming from Latin America, or even from the United States, who don't have much money, and they really want to get to know Cuba. And obviously, you can help them out, spend less money. It's not your case, of course, But and in that case, you say, well, let's take public transportation, let's go to the Cuban stores and things like that. But in general terms, the tourist industry in Cuba was developed to attract fresh cash, and especially cash, because people were bringing cash. And that's another issue with the blockade. Cuba had to trade with cash, which, in the 21st century, when most of the transactions in the world are electronic, Cuba actually had to go with a suitcase of cash to another country because Cuba is not allowed to use the US dollar in banks transactions. So you had to go with someone had to go with a suitcase full of cash, like kind of narco traffic guys, those drug lords, and go to Mexico, to Panama, and deposit it there with a local institution in order to use the cash, because Cuba is not allowed to use US dollars in international transactions. And that's why Cuba put a tax on US dollar, because they were encouraging people to bring other currency like euros, British pounds, or so on. Because but even if you have euros, for Cuba to have a financial transaction with international banks, if it's a subject of the U.S., cannot do it legally, even if in euros. Even if the bank is totally independent of the United States, the United States can sanctions. And in fact, we see very often European institution banks or enterprises that have been sanctioned by the United States by trading with Cuba. So for Cuba, it's a complex thing. So on one hand, you have tourists and you bring cash, but on the other hand, how are you going to use that cash internationally to buy things? Now, going back to your original question, yes, I mean, I think from the 1990s until even today, well, except the pandemic, because the pandemic changed everything. Before the pandemic, emerging sector of the economy that was doing better than a lot of professionals. Now, a lot of professionals also, as you said, have a side job. For example, doctors generally had cars because cars were given by the government to professionals. So, they work as a doctor, and on weekends they work as a taxi drivers. And it is very kind of sad to see a surgeon to be driving a taxi, but that was the reality. Myself, I did translation, I did guide tourists, and that gave me extra currency. And I think that was a tendency, a lot of people, especially a lot of professionals who work in the state sector, to have a side job. Or your wife have rent a room. A lot of people who rent rooms were professionals that they're not necessarily entrepreneurs, basic entrepreneurs. So, a professional who the salary wasn't enough, but you have a room to rent, you fix it a little bit, and you rent it. And that's how you get extra cash. I know. I can tell you hundreds of cases of professionals who develop some side jobs in the private sector without leaving the profession, or making a family business. For example, if it's a car, the father tell the son, look, use the car as a taxi driver, and go to the airport, pick up some tourists, and make extra cash. Or the house or the wife, they say, well, I want to accommodate this room and we'll rent it to tourists. Yes, it is. It was a problem, and the CUC, it was creating. Not the CUC itself. That model was creating inequalities. It was creating differences, and to be honest, it was something that bothered a lot of people. I mean, even bothered to somebody who say, "Look, I went to college 10 years to become a surgeon, and on weekends I have to be a taxi driver," and that's bothered anyone. Now, most people can understand that we're in a crisis understood the blockade. Because if we have to find a responsible for this, and this is not a justification of our problem, but if we have to find responsible, it's the U.S. blockade. And that's why we don't call it embargo, because it's not even an embargo. It's an international blockade. I mean, U.S. blockade third countries that trade with Cuba, that create businesses in Cuba. You know, like the Melia Coiba is a Spanish hotel chain. All the managers of those hotels are sanctioned by the United States. They can't go to the United States, they can't get a visa because they're investing in Cuba. So whoever who want to invest in Cuba, they have to take the extra risk. If you have a ship from Greek that will bring goods from Europe to Cuba, they will charge you more to Cuba, 3-4 times more. Why? Because that ship, if that ship docks in Cuba, the U.S. sanctioned that ship not to dock in the United States for 6 months or 1 year. And of course, the U.S. market of 300 million people is much more attractive than Cuban market. So a lot of ships who want to come to Cuba, they will charge you 3-4 times. And goods that being produced by the United States, in order for Cuba, in order to buy them, you have to buy them in a much higher price because you have to buy it to intermediaries who are willing to risk. So it is a very complex. But going to what you're saying, I mean, it was a problem, and I think it still is a problem. We do have problem of inequalities, and we do have problems implementing an economic model that goes along the lines of what we want. My personal opinion is that we have to continue working on this, and beside the blockade. I mean, and we need to continue fighting against the blockade, because if the blockade is lifted tomorrow, the situation will change drastically, significantly. I mean, if Biden say tomorrow, look, blockade is over, we will be talking something different now. And I would say as fast as in a week. As fast as in a week. Just allowing Americans to come to Cuba will change everything.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. I mean, the reason I was pushing you a little bit is because I wanted you to talk about some of those issues that U.S. leftists will sometimes... There's a lot of confusion about because every socialist political project has internal contradictions. And I think the U.S. socialist left doesn't bother enough to actually investigate it themselves and can sometimes arrive at really bad conclusions. So I wanted to push you just a little bit to talk about what you just said, which I think was a great explanation of why those contradictions exist. All right, so let's bring it back to Asia.
From our perspective, or at least from my perspective as, someone in Korea and involved in, socialist leftist political activism in Korea, I can't help but notice certain similarities between the situation perhaps in Korean Peninsula and the situation in Cuba. North Korea and Cuba are most severely embargoed countries on this planet, and both are practically under siege from U.S. imperialism. I wanted to ask about what Cuba's relationship to North Korea and your perspective on North Korea. And I guess we could also talk about Cuban support and vice versa to various Asian socialist countries.
The relationship with North Korea are stable and fine politically, but there's a lot of distance. That's how I see it. There's no much relation in practical terms. Politically, yes, we voted in various issues together, and we support each other's sovereignty and independence. But I'm not sure, in what terms if there's any trade. I know some trade, but very minor, very minor, and there's not much exchanges. We do have an embassy on North Korea here. Cuba has an embassy there, but there's not much student exchanges or workers exchanges, as far as I know. I think people see North Korea as a country who is independent and sovereign, and people respect that. But generally, if you ask Cubans, average Cubans about North Korea, and there's not much information. Yes, we do have more information than other countries, but there's no like kind of Vietnam or China in which we have, here we have the Confucian Institute. We have Chinese people coming here to Cuba. We have a Chinatown. We have a lot of Cubans who have gone to China to study. So, this, and this trade relation, their businesses. And the same thing with Vietnam. It's a lot of people gone there and so on, back and forth. But with North Korea, I'm not sure it's the same. And my take is that it's very minimal. Well, first of all, the common sense of average Cubans, to my opinion, North Korea, is like, wow, this is a brave country. They stand up against the United States, and they will not negotiate with the manipulation of the United States. So I believe we have a perception of being a very strong country, and I'm not saying necessarily economically, but definitely in terms of defense, military. In fact, that's what I'm saying. He met with Trump. Trump's never met with any Cuban authority, and I think Kim Jong-un has been able to negotiate very well every talk or any discussion with the United States in the favor of people of North Korea. In terms of defense, I really don't have any idea what kind of a military agreement the Cuban government might have with North Korea. But if there's any, I don't think it's very strong. I think Cuba will have better military relations with Russia, with Venezuela, obviously, than actually North Korea. Russia is not necessarily a political ally. There's much more similarity with North Korea than Russia. But I believe there's a much more, in terms of defense, military defense, I think Russia has much more to say into that. Now, Cuba has its own defense system. And I think, the military strategy of Cuba is called the People's War. That means that everybody will come out to defend the country, everyone. Everyone here has some sort of knowledge of military training or knowledge of what to do in case of invasion. And I think the major threat for the United States not to invade Cuba is because this is going to, if the United States pretend or try to do a military intervention, this is going to be worse than Vietnam. That means the whole country will go to war. And that's somehow that the United States will not want to take the risk. The United States military is much more powerful than Cuba. There's no question about it. But in terms of taking over Cuba, it will be much more difficult. There's a sense of patriotism here in Cuba, very strong, that people are willing to die for the country. If there's any type of intervention, everybody will go out to offer their life. That would be a disaster, national disaster, because this is, everybody said that if there's any attempt to attack Cuba, this is not going to be Vietnam. This is going to be worse than Vietnam for the United States, and could be a very long war. But in terms of North Korea cooperation, I unfortunately have no idea, and it's even difficult for me to guess. And if there's something, there may be something very secret. I mean, if I see something, I see more Russia. I see Russia military cooperation than North Korea. I see Venezuelan cooperation than actually North Korea. I see even some African countries willing to offer the collaboration. Africa, Angola, a lot of Africans countries who are thanks to Cubans because a lot of Cubans went to support the independence movement. So Africa is a long-time friend of Cuba, and politically, diplomatically, African countries are always voted along with Cuba. There's been a cooperation. Of course, the military power of Africa is not as strong as Russian military, but I imagine more cooperation in that side than actually with North Korea.
I mean, because of the embargo, both on Cuba and on North Korea, I guess there are a lot of practical difficulties in the two countries developing material and economic kind of relations. Something kind of related to that about the situation in both North Korea and Cuba. in South Korea, we have U.S. military bases occupying South Korea, basically threatening North Korea with U.S. missiles and U.S. Weapon systems. And I think in case of Cuba, you have the Guantanamo base and its naval bases. So I think that's another similarity. So if I were to continue looking into that similarity a bit more, to defend against U.S. aggression, North Korea spends a lot of resources developing weapons, especially nuclear programs. I was wondering what are some Cuban strategies to safeguard the revolution against any potential U.S. aggression. Of course, I'm just asking your opinion rather than any sort of official government policy, like what your understanding of how Cuba will defend itself.
Again, Cuba has its own military strategy. And obviously, a lot of the strategies is very secretive. But as far as everybody knows here, we all know that Cuba had the very intelligent means to defend itself. And that's a way to deter the United States of invading. Now, again, it's just difficult for me to give an opinion. The only thing I know is just Cuba has a good military defense strategy, and it's proven because otherwise the United States had invaded before or had some military intervention. Now during these months, and this goes to our current days, the possibility of a humanitarian intervention are very high. And because Cuba is going through difficult times, the pandemic, the economic situation is very difficult right now. The aggression from Miami are at the highest point. So a humanitarian intervention, we all know, is a military intervention. We all know that humanitarian is just a name. It's just basically sending military troops here and take over. And that Cuba is very alert. And that's why Cuba is very clear on that will not allow any conditions or any attempt to foreign forces or even internal forces to create any type of condition to justify an intervention. But the humanitarian intervention, it is in the process. I mean, there are around 500,000 people who signed in the United States in favor of military intervention. A lot of people calling for the SOS Cuba, trying to rescue Cuba from the crisis. And in Cuba, we're trying to counteract that offensive, especially in the social network, where now the words is developed now it's non-conventional. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the non-conventional word manuals of the State Departments and the CIA. That basically you need to create a cultural war. You need to create fake news and create a state of opinion among average Cubans, so they will say yes. And not average Cuban, but also international community say yes. Cuba is in a crisis. We need a humanitarian intervention. Security Council will pass a resolution to allow UN military to go to Cuba, and that means U.S. military. Fortunately, China and Russia, we believe, will not vote against any resolution for that. But the United States doesn't need that security resolution to invade another country. So, recently they were requesting countries around the world. They only got 20 countries. Colombia, Brazil, all these right-wingers countries that will support a humanitarian intervention. Only 20 countries. So the United States really failed. And, and why? Why? Because recently in the UN, more than 800 countries voted against the blockade. And every year, the UN passed a resolution against the blockade. Every year since 1992, it's been the vast majority of countries around the world. They say, look, it's time to lift the blockade. I believe only United States and Israel are the only two countries who voted against that resolution. One or two other countries who abstained, but mostly it's the US and Israel. That the only countries in the world that have the chain to vote against a resolution that the majority of the country vote in favor. So I think Cuba also politically is doing a lot. And Cuba even have diplomatic supporters from countries who are not necessarily allies, and Western Europe and even Chile. Chile has a right-wing government who voted in favor of lifting the blockade. So I think the struggle had to do around the blockade, and Cuba has doing excellent diplomatic work. Since 1992, has established diplomatic relationship with practically every single country in the world, including the United States. During the Obama, which is now where the worst moment. And that diplomatic action, and also see other countries not to necessarily easily fall into the strategies of the United States to take over.
Well, that actually touches into the next question. It's probably the thing that our viewers are the most keen on, which is that obviously Cuba has been in the news a lot lately due to these recent protests. And I wanted to know what's your analysis of what drove this upsurge. To kind of touch on what you said about the U.S. trying to instigate regime change, I wanted to ask what your thoughts were on these recent protests in Cuba, especially since you mentioned culture wars, and we know a certain rap group, I think they're called the San Isidro movement, is behind this, which has links to the U.S. government.
Well, the United States government have millions of dollars invested in a cultural work against Cuba, and that's not classified. That's open. The USA to the National Endowment for Democracy, through all these private agencies around, not only in the United States but also in other countries, are receiving federal money, taxpayer money, to fight the social network and the media against Cuba. Even Marco Rubio, the senator of Marco Rubio, came out when he talked about the demonstrations, the manifestation in Cuba on July 11, posted a video that was fake. Even a senator, a fake, and Cuba came out and denounced it. Even Michelle Bachelet, the higher commissioner of the human rights group of the UN, used a picture that was taken from a revolutionary woman that I know personally, who actually was not protesting, actually was defending the revolution, and used it as a picture as a protesters. So it's a great deal of manipulation, tons of fake news, tons of mercenaries. United States is literally paying people here to go and throw rocks and then upload the video. And go and then come out with a sign and throw a video just to create. They want to repeat what they did in Ukraine, what they did in Eastern Europe with color revolutions. They're creating all the conditions to allow some sort of intervention, and that it is used with a lot of money. I mean, a lot of money stayed in the middle, but a lot of money is coming with individuals who come take the 50-minute flight from Florida to Havana, full of cash. They come and they pay. And there's a secret network trying to overthrow. For today, the Miami people were calling for protests. And it failed. Every day they're calling to people to go out the street, to take over the government, and they have to come out, this general died, we don't know how he died, and all this type of fake news that is misleading the international opinion. This demonstration that happened on July 11th, there were few hundred people. You look at the demonstration in South Korea, how the police repress, or Spain, or United States, everywhere. And it's not big news. The same day on July 11, dozens of people died in demonstrations in South Africa, and they didn't make it to the news. But here in Cuba, one person died. It was a huge news. And that person who died actually was killed by the demonstrators, was not even killed by the police. So it is a purpose to give a distorted vision of Cuba, and that's how they are creating this a state of opinion to justify their action.
I'm just curious, how though the U.S. government funnels into these groups. We know about the fake news, but I remember there was an article in the Gray Zone recently that talked about how the U.S. government sort of funds these culture groups, and they specifically target marginalized groups in Cuba, people of darker complexion.
I'm very active in the social network, and recently Facebook eliminated my account. I run several groups on Facebook, on Telegram, and Twitter, and Cuban revolutionaries we're taking a proactive action in the social network, because we know that a lot of things in the social networks, the work is being developed there. We are at work there. We're being invaded with every single minute with news, with fake news, with all the things, and all this funding that's coming to create an artificial opposition, because in Cuba there's no a genuine opposition. All these opposition leaders are being created by the United States. I mean, there's a group here in Cuba that analyze every single person who outspoken from the dissident groups. And every single, I'm going to say 100%, they have a link with one of those groups. They travel to the United States, they got scholarship in the United States, or Spain, or any country. They've been receiving money. They have contract to get money. For example, they take these very mediocre artists who, basically they say, we'll buy your art. They buy the art with a good prices, and they say, we buy your art, but you need to talk against the dictatorship. And that's it. All these artists that go to Miami to have a contract to play salsa music or when any Cuban culture, in order to get a contract, you have to say, I'm against the dictatorship. Basically, you can't. The revolutionary artists cannot perform in Miami because they will never say, I'm against the dictatorship. But some artists say, well, I will say it because I need the contract. So there's a lot of money going, and all these agencies, there's a lot of research done on this. There's a lot of groups that are chasing all the money. There's a group called the Cuba Money Project, and I will recommend it to all of you to look at. And I know it's an American journalist. He's an investigative journalist who has traced all the money that come from federal government to all different agencies, private agencies, and go to all different, going to all the people.
Well, yeah, I mean, that viral song, Patria y Vida, which is a right-wing inversion of Patria y Muertos, like homeland or death. It's like homeland or life. I mean, for one thing, it's just a bad song. So like this like CIA-funded art is also just like not even good music. So it's just always something I found funny.
Just imagine rapping for the U.S. government.
Exactly. We are deeply grateful for you spending so much time with us. We're almost 3 hours. You took 3 hours out of your precious weekend. I know you have a new young daughter. Like, it's not easy to schedule this kind of stuff. So we really appreciate that. But before we go, any last rounds of questions or comments?
Well, I just want to thank you for the opportunity, for the great opportunity. Thank you, all of you, for the opportunity to allow me to talk a little bit about my experience in Cuba and about my perspective.
Yeah, Jay and I had a conversation regarding this topic previously, and we touched on it with our questions. But I think it's important to understand that, for all our listeners and for ourselves, that the struggle in Cuba and struggle in Korea are one and the same. So as Jay mentioned, we are both struggling against U.S. military hegemony. And I think one interesting thing is that what I observed 2 years ago was that when Iran was fighting back against U.S. aggression by shooting down U.S. spy drones, forces were pulled from the Korean peninsula, kind of easing the pressure on DPRK and China. So, in a sense, if whenever we struggle against U.S. military apparatus, we are, in a sense, helping comrades from across the world. I would like to ask all our listeners to combat any narratives online or offline about the situation in Cuba in favor of color revolutions or any sort of humanitarian intervention. Because while the material forces and physical assets of US military can be stretched thin, they still do have very strong grasp on media and all sorts of narratives all over the world. So it's our duty as leftists to fight that whenever we can.